the cold case cop impersonator finally exposed as a killer. He looked like law enforcement. The badge, the confidence, the way he spoke, calm, controlled, authoritative. If he pulled you over, you wouldn't question it. And that's exactly how he got away with it. For years, witnesses described a man who acted like a cop. Someone who knew procedures, knew how to gain trust, knew how to make people feel just safe enough to let their guard down. But there was one problem. No department claimed him, no record, no identity, no trace of who he really was. The case went cold, buried under confusion and fear, until one detail, overlooked for years, finally connected everything. And when investigators uncovered the truth, they realized the man pretending to protect people was the one hunting them. At first, the reports didn't seem connected. A late-night stop on a quiet road. A driver pulled over by someone who looked like law enforcement. The details were always similar. Flashing lights, a calm voice, a sense of authority that made people comply without hesitation. For most, it ended with confusion, a strange interaction, maybe a warning. Something that didn't feel quite right, but not enough to report immediately, until one incident changed everything. A victim was found under circumstances that immediately raised alarm. There were signs of control, of manipulation, not random violence, but something calculated. Witness descriptions started surfacing, and that's when a disturbing pattern began to form. Multiple people had encountered the same type of individual, a man posing as a police officer. He wasn't just wearing something that looked official. He acted the part flawlessly. He knew how to approach vehicles, how to speak with authority, how to create just enough pressure to make someone obey without question. It suggested something deeper than imitation. It suggested familiarity. Investigators quickly realized they weren't dealing with a typical offender. This person understood procedure, or at least, he understood it well enough to replicate it convincingly. Roadside encounters became the center of the investigation. Reports were re-examined. Witnesses who had dismissed earlier experiences were contacted again. And slowly, the pieces began to align. Same type of vehicle, similar locations, isolated roads, low visibility, minimal traffic, consistent behavior patterns, controlled tone, specific commands, strategic positioning. It wasn't coincidence, it was method. But the biggest problem remained the same. No one could identify him. When law enforcement agencies were contacted, none of them recognized the individual. No officer matched the descriptions. No badge number checked out. No patrol records aligned with the times and places of the incidents. Whoever he wasn't part of any official department. And that realization changed the entire direction of the case. Because now investigators weren't just looking for a suspect. They were looking for someone who had deliberately built a false identity and used it to gain access to victims who would normally feel protected in that situation. That kind of deception requires planning, it requires confidence, and most of all, it requires an understanding of human behavior. People trust authority, especially on the road, in the dark, when someone signals them to stop. It's almost automatic. That instinct, designed to keep people safe, was being turned against them. As more information surfaced, another layer of the case began to emerge. This wasn't a one-time event. There had been earlier complaints, small, scattered, easy to dismiss at the time. Reports of suspicious stops, unofficial warnings, encounters that didn't quite make sense but didn't escalate far enough to trigger a full investigation. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they told a different story. A timeline began to form, stretching back years. The same behavior, the same setup, the same type of interaction repeated over and over again, evolving slightly each time. It suggested experience, learning, adaptation. Whoever this person was, he wasn't improvising. He was refining his method. And that's what made the situation more dangerous with time. Because every encounter that went unreported, every moment that slipped through unnoticed, allowed him to become more confident, more precise, more difficult to detect. Investigators were no longer dealing with a mystery. They were dealing with someone who had spent years perfecting how to stay invisible. And the most unsettling part? He was hiding in plain sight, not as himself, as someone people were trained to trust. By the time investigators realized they were dealing with a pattern, the case had already stretched across years of scattered reports, half memories, and moments people had brushed off as just strange. Now, everything had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Every complaint was reopened. Every witness was contacted again, this time with a different question. Not what happened, but who was he pretending to be? That shift changed everything, because when people revisited those encounters, the details became sharper. The tone of his voice, the way he stood, the specific phrases he used, even the equipment, lights, possibly a radio, something that made the situation feel official enough to trust. Individually, those details meant very little. Together, they revealed intent. This wasn't just someone pretending for attention. This was someone who had studied authority, how it looks, how it sounds, how it feels to the person on the receiving end. He understood hesitation, he understood fear, and more importantly, he understood compliance. That meant one thing. He had likely done this many times before, but the breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic discovery. It came from something smaller, something investigators had seen before but hadn't fully connected. A vehicle. Across multiple reports, witnesses described a similar type of car, not identical but close enough to raise questions. Color variations, slight differences, but the same general model, the same setup, the same presence at the right places in the wrong times. That detail became the anchor. Traffic records were reviewed. Registration databases were scanned. Cross-references were built based on geography, time frames, and ownership patterns. It wasn't fast, but it was precise. And eventually, one name surfaced. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him. No official ties to law enforcement. No badge. No department history. On paper, he was just another individual, someone living an ordinary life, moving through the same spaces as everyone else, which is exactly why he had never been questioned. But when investigators looked closer, subtle inconsistencies began to appear. His vehicle matched too closely. His movements aligned with key timelines. And most importantly, he had access to the kind of equipment that could make his impersonation believable. That was enough to move forward. Surveillance began quietly. Just like in many long-term cases, there was no rush, only careful observation. They needed something undeniable, and eventually, they got it. Evidence was collected. Connections were confirmed. Patterns were solidified into proof. The man who had spent years hiding behind authority was finally seen for who he really was. When the arrest happened, it didn't feel like the end of a mystery. It felt like the removal of a mask, because that's what this case had always been about. Not just a crime, but deception at its deepest level. The manipulation of trust, the use of authority as a weapon. And for many people, that was the hardest part to process. The idea that something designed to protect had been imitated so convincingly that it became dangerous. For the victims and those who had encountered him, the truth brought clarity, but not comfort. It answered questions, but it also forced them to re-examine moments they once trusted. And for investigators, it was a reminder of how easily patterns can be missed when they're hidden inside something familiar, because he didn't hide in the shadows. He stood in plain sight, just wearing the wrong identity. And for years, that was enough. If this story made you question how easily trust can be manipulated, how something that looks safe might not always be, then you're starting to see the deeper side of these cases, because the most dangerous stories aren't always the loudest ones. They're the ones that feel normal until they don't. So if you want more real cases, more hidden details, and stories that stay with you long after they end, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who won't see it coming, and subscribe to the channel, because the next story might look ordinary too.